What's up, everyone? Peter Exodus Okafor here, back for another round of history, and I've been waiting to do this for months. Thought about it a lot, did a lot of research on this because it's one thing to talk about the funk, it's another thing to really define what funk is. So, and I've mentioned briefly in other podcasts, I'm on some of those. Funk groups on Facebook. You have the fan pages and the old chat rooms back from the late 90s, early 2000s. But Facebook wisely has adopted this, and boy, oh boy, they'll have some knockdown, drag out fights as to what is the funk and what is not the funk. I usually stay out of that, and kind of, you know, metaphorically, pop some popcorn and enjoy the fight. But I have to say, before I really got into this, I had a very narrowly defined vision of the funk. And so a lot of the things I consider funk now, I didn't a while back. But, again, I did some research. So, The Funk, the Music, the People, and the Rhythm of the One by Ricky Vincent. That's kind of the definitive book on funk. Um, some very good documentaries which really helped me on YouTube. The Story of the Funk, One Nation Under a Groove. Finding the Funk 2013 by Nelson George. That's a very powerful one. And that was the last one I watched and kind of pulled it all together. Funk Music, a documentary, and Funk, a documentary. And so, in these various documentaries, some of them they talk to members of the old classic funk bands. Some of them talk to quote unquote the new Funketeers or NAU funk. Because funk has never died. It just kind of reinvents itself. And of course, hip hop is a child of the funk. So, and hip hop's the next trip, the next destination on the history tour, so to speak. So, what is the funk? It comes from jazz, and at least parts of the funk. Because black jazz artists referred to the funk back in the 50s. And so, of course, a lot of that, what we have to remember, again, we're talking history. There was a big universal fire sometime in the 2010s. I don't know if it was 2011 or 2012, and a lot of master tapes were burned in that. And there were a lot of prominent rock groups that were burned in that, but there were a lot of blues and jazz artists. And for some of those artists, that was it. I mean, those were the master tapes and may never get, found. So, occasionally if find old jazz, if you like that old music or some old jazz music and you hear the pops and stuff, oh, that's a sound effect, from vinyl. No, that's probably the actual vinyl because the masters were probably destroyed in Universal Fire. So if you're interested, just Google Universal Fire and look at the list of the artists who lost their masters. Not as big, for the folks even, from the 60s and the 70s on, but for those old school folks, who knows what were lost. And I assume Keith Richards and Eric Clapton have huge blues record collections, and I'd be curious to know if they have stuff that's no longer available because of that fire. So yeah. So one of the essence of funk and that came up a lot from the musicians who played it is, funk was played by real musicians. So this is before drum machines, and they were saying, it's pretty hard, for funk to, true funk without, a real drummer and a real bass player and all that stuff. Yeah. I get it, and for the most part, I agree. But the good thing is, I'll get to these later. There are hacks to every there's things change and uh, technology comes along. You think, well, stuff ain't as funky as it used to be, and then someone comes up with a hack to um, to take the new and the good you know um, advances from technology, uh, but funkify it again, so it's back to the level of the funk that it was before. So I will get to that, as we go through. But the other thing is everybody kind of gets to eat in the funk. James Brown made sure his band, you know, gets fed, so to speak, on stage. And George Clinton's the master of feeding his band. Whether it's giving the keyboard a soloist, maggot brain, guitar solos, drum solos, the horns. I mean, everybody. That's what the funk's about, and it's about vibing. Um, so the Facebook groups and the fight over what is the one and what does the one mean in funk. There's two, there are aspects, there are actually a musical aspect to the one, and then there's the philosophy of the one. And this is why I'm attracted to the funk. And even though it's interesting, even though, I mean, you can, the early funkadelic stuff, funky plus psychedelic rock, and you're like, yeah, it's funky, but and Prince wasn't always funky, but he always said he's a funk artist at heart and rooted in the funk. So funk is a state of mind, and and so my music isn't always heavy in the funk, but it's all my state of mind is in the funk. So, the philosophy of the funk, unity of the one, the individual freedom and dance, the balance. Back in the 70s, black power, but also black solidarity. So, so funk is that unity, and that's when good funk sound, you and I, where you just want to party and it's happy and flashlight. You just want to, Now, I mean, I'm sure back in the day in the clubs they'd actually go in with flashlights and turn it on and spin around, and now you can do that with your phone. But there's that joy of dance and that joy, on the dance floor and just singing and having a good time. I mean, uh, you know, a Frankie Beverly concert. I mean, they love Frankie here in Indianapolis, and when Joy and Pain and the whole crowd will sing, that's common now. I mean, millennials and Gen Z love to sing to the back. If you go listen to the live music from the 70s and 80s, that wasn't the case. But there's always that aspect of that unity of the funk, and that's the one. Um, the common purpose. Um, and so you had Motown and the synchronized steps, and P Funk never synchronized nothing. They just went out there and danced and did their own thing. And then you had James Brown, who synchronized the steps and also did his own thing. So the focus on the solidarity, aspect of the funk makes it inherently political. So what changed me is my definition of funk is the last documentary I watched was Finding the Funk, with that Nelson George put together. And one of I think it was, I don't know if it was a tour, it was a white boomer now. I don't know if he was an engineer, a tour manager. I can't even remember his name, but he said, P Funk and Earth, Wind and Fire were doing the same things, but they just did it in a different way. And I thought to myself, 'cause I always, until that moment, I was like, well, Earth, and Wind and Fire was, you know, R&B band that sometime got funky because the music of the streets in the 70s and the early 80s was the funk, and so if you wanted to be stay street legal, so to speak, every once in a while you had to drop the funk. Um, I mean, well, I'm doing hip hop next, but it's kind of funny because you got a Drake album and Drake's doing all his stuff, and I love Drake. He's a great songwriter. But you got Jimmy Cooks in the last album, this album, and the last album, you got Knife Talk. So Drake still got to stick a cut in that album, so everybody knows he's street legal, so to speak. But going back to that statement, that's when I was like, yeah, because George was landing the spaceships, or the spaceship on stage, and he had the whole science fiction thing going on, and I write sci-fi and fantasy, and to me, George is one of the big Afrofuturists. He was the first major uh, one to bust onto the stage in a big way. Octavia Butler, as a novelist, is another one, and Samuel Delaney is another one. So they were sort of contemporaries of George Clinton, but they were not at the level of George. So so that was the aha moment for me, and that's what kind of broke it all open. Um, So let's talk about the actual music element of the one. I know basic, music theory. So I mean, I know chords, I know minor and major scales, but I know Rick Beato. If you listen to the Rise and the Fall, when I did my literature review, I talked a lot about Rick Beato. Rick Beato knows his music theory. So I'm going to explain, the one in a more in a non-musical kind of vein. And the one, I mean, one of the favorite sayings of my Facebook funk groups, there's about two or three of them, is if it's not on the one, it ain't funk. And I was just kind of like, not true. It's a hack. And the other myth out there is that James Brown invented the one. Not true. Now James Brown, he didn't invent the initial one, but he invented about three or four different ways to do the one. And the first one and the most prominent one, he didn't invent it, but he had about three or four other ones that he invented that I can remember off the top of my head. So he still is the king of the one. But what did I say? Ray Charles. That was the first instance that people can track to the one. 1959, Hit the Road Jack. This is the first big hit with the one. So what did Ray do with the one? Well, Ray either by well he this was 2 track back when he was doing this, so he what his version of the one was just really emphasizing the snare. So boom, boom, boom. And what the one does is it's kind of like the sun in our universe. It kind of orders the song and kind of gives it a different type of order and just gives it more swing and more drive and more groove naturally. Um, and the one is still very prominent today. I remember I was just doing whatever and at home because I'll have the music in the background from my cable. Head down to classic rock and Dirty Laundry. I can't is that Glenn Fry or Don Henley? I think it's Don Henley, but that was playing. I was wait a minute. Dirty Laundry's on the one, and it is. And then Pour Some Sugar on Me by Def Leppard's on the one. So the one has become very prominent. By the mid '70s, pretty much everybody who did R&B, um, whether they were funk or not, had that big clap. And it's just kind of like you find a hole in the sound and the sound in the song, and you just stick that clap, or or when you're mixing, or you either have your drummer hit the snare, one of the snares hard, or you just like mix the volume of that snare up in the mix, and that's kind of like that's the most common version of the one, and it just orders the song, and gives it more, for whatever reason, gives it swing, but it works, and that's I call it a hack to the funk. Now again, the one of the misconceptions is if you're not on the one, it ain't funky. James had a lot of songs in the 70s that we would all consider funky that was 901. Sly, more often than not, was 901, but when you talk about the Mount Rushmore of funk, people always talk about James Brown, Sly Stone, George Clinton, and Bootsy. So, yeah, the one is a unifying force in a song that pulls the song together and gives it um, I don't know, and it just makes that groove hit harder. Um, Motown. So I did a took their first. So Motown's first hit was in 1960 was "Shop Around." So I was just curious because James dropped a brand new bag in '64, and that's really James when he was talking about a brand new bag. He was talking about the funk, and so everybody's like, "Oh well, it's Cold Sweater." I got that feeling when James went to one. Well, like anything in life, I mean, the funk evolved with James, and I really think it starts in '64 with Papa has got a brand new bag, and really with Superbad. I think Superbad dropped in '70. That's really when funk really he got it. It all came together. I mean, even Sex Machine, he was still tinkering, but by Superbad, James knew, he knew all the elements. He was a Jedi by then. He was the master of the funk. But going, looking at '64 and looking at all of so got one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight songs. Can I Get a Witness? My Guy. Where Did Our Love Go? Baby, I Need Your Lovin'. Dancing in the Streets. Baby Love. How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You. My Girl. So those are all, we all know those songs. Which one of those were on the one? My Guy, Dancing in the Streets, Baby Love, and My Girl. So even when James dropped Papa's got a brand new bag. Even Motown, which and I need to do a whole season two of which is going to be exclusively YouTube. Season two of Level Up. Uh, I'm gonna do duels, and one of the duels is going to be Motown and Stax. So even though Motown isn't considered funk per se until maybe Rick James, but I would consider the early '70s Temptations funk. Uh, in '64 they had half of their songs that we all know. Four of the eight were on the one, using the Ray Charles snare method. Um, so that's kind of how the funk developed. No, I say James Brown is still rightfully the godfather of funk, and he's still the the godfather of the one, because James, I mean, most folks use the snare. Then I said in the mid '70s, um, the clap came in, but James has used a guitar chord, and James didn't do guitar chords very often. But a good guitar chord, he's used horns, he's used and nobody else has used these type of instruments to do the one. It's always pretty much at least until later it was always pretty much that snare, or by the mid '70s the clap. And so he also has used the horns. He would use um, a trombone as well at times. So James, found many ways, different ways to hit the one. Um, so there was a big blow up one day, a couple, I would say, earlier this year, uh, on one of the Facebook funk groups, and so someone said, well, Bootsy was James's bass player, and then left and went to George Clinton, and so someone said, yeah, Bootsy left James and went to George and taught George the one. And folks lost. We had a lot of laughing emojis on that one. And at the time, I was like, nah, dude. Because if you go back and listen to that first Funkadelic album, I mean, you know the the snares accented, so it is on the one. And he's like, well, George said himself that Bootsy taught him in the one, and but in this research, he was actually correct. George did say, yeah, Bootsy, when Bootsy came, he taught us the one. Well, it was a variation of the one. It was one of the ones that um, uh, I think he gives James credit, but it was crafted. He Bootsy was probably only with James for about 18 months, but it was he crafted this version of the one. In this version of the one, you emphasize the bass drum on it, so it's that first bass hit. Uh, and that was so when George is talking about Bootsy taught me the one, he taught that's the one he brought. And a lot of folks didn't the snare is more popular than hit that bass drum one. And I mean, not only Bootsy in his studio stuff, he would accent that bass hit with a synth, or yeah, a synth bass too, so to really emphasize it. And really, if you Bootsy has a live album. It's not on the streaming services right now, but it's here on YouTube, called "Keeping the Funk Alive" in '95. So listen to the first minute of "Stretching Out," and that is Bootsy's version of the one. Because everybody's hitting the one, and in the beginning of "Stretching Out," the whole band, not just the bass drum. Not I mean everybody's hitting the one. And it's still that version of the one was used, but it was not as prominent as the snare one. Now P Funk used both. So P Funk used the one on the bass drum, and they accented the snare through the whole career. So so to clear that one up, yeah, P Funk was on the one before Bootsy got there, but they got more on the one when he arrived. Um, so as I said earlier, I mean, I'm not a big gamer. I mean, when I was in the '70s as a kid, I would play Space Invaders, that kind of stuff. But I've never been a Sony PlayStation guy. But using that vernacular, the one is a cheat code. It's a hack to the funk. And I think one day about a year ago, I just jumped into the Billboard chart. How many songs were on the one? And I think like a third of the songs. And pop stuff. I mean, you wouldn't even. I think even Billie Eilish was on the one. You wouldn't think of Billie Eilish. So that's this is the snare essentially. So that's how prominent the one is now in all forms of music. Uh, it actually, the most prominent is "Four to the Floor," that came out of disco, that most people associate with house and techno. That's the most prominent beat by a little bit, not much over the one. But So yeah, so that's kind of the physical form of the one. Um, I mentioned earlier about musicians talking about you got to go to church because funk really is a live band thing. Well, um, towards the late 70s and into the early 80s, uh, the drummers went away, and the drum machine came in. And ironically, Prince was, I mean, I'm gonna do a whole Prince thing, but Prince uh, uh, fired the horns essentially. I mean, the Minneapolis sound, the essence of that, and it's really, the Minneapolis sound is really only controversy in 1999, but really what the Minneapolis sound encompassed was uh, taking the horn sections, the horn players out and using a synthesizer, brass pads, and the drummer, and uh, and using a drum machine. Prince is famous for the Lynn drum machine. Well, why was this done? For practical reasons. It takes a while to tune a drum, and that time is money. That back then was very very expensive. To rent a studio. It's not that expensive anymore, and I haven't rented a studio since my first album. So there's ways, there's ways to treat your cheaply to treat your home to to do but that wasn't the case back then. So it was expensive, number one. Um, and you know towards the late 70s, early 80s. Bands changed because not everybody wrote the songs. So if everybody, the old funksters, ride Cameo because they fired the horn section and fired most of the band. They became hired people. Even though they rode and were Cameo back in the 70s, but Larry Blackman and the other two gentlemen, I mean, they were the songwriters, and even the Rolling Stones, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger made more money than Charlie Watts and Bill Wyman because they wrote the songs, and Bill didn't like that, and I think he left had enough and left in the early '90s. So that's kind of the whole uh, that's the history, but the pare down and make money. The other thing is, if you look at these '70s bands, I mean, they rolled, some of them were 15, 20 people deep, and with MTV, I mean, you know, for branding purposes, you wanted to shine the light on some people in the band, and so part of that was, okay, you're the songwriters and the singers, so we're going to shine the light on you. And it sucks, but hey, you're not the songwriter here. You'll get paid, but this is Cameo now. So that's kind of so that was part of the revolution going on in the early '80s with music, and with the drum machines, uh, the funk was in peril. Well, the cheat code to hack to that was Roland synthesizers came out with the SH-101, and backing up a few years, Flashlight by P-Funk, was famous, was the first song to use a synth bass. So they used a mini Moog bass off of that, and I mean, it's a classic funk song. And so really, what the in the late '70s and early '80s, band. Think of those bands, those Lakeside and Zap and uh, uh, the Daz Band and the Gap Band, and the bass. That bass was thumping, even more so than Flashlight. And I always hang the hat on that SH-101, that really big fat analog bass. And what that kind of, it had the same effect as power chords having rock songs. It just drove it. And so you could put that over a drum beat that pretty sad and it changed a whole lot and it just drove the song into into the land of funk, just that the energy of that. Now bands would also mix and use a mix of drum machine and a live drummer too. But it was really the new cheat code was really that fat bass. In the late '70s, early '80s, as the drum machine came into use. So my relationship with the funk? Why do I love the funk so much? Why do I always shout out I have a funky jam talking about the Naptown Funk? To me, it's celebratory music. It's the '70s were filled with were kind of bittersweet for the black community. Hope and promise, and heartbreak here and there. It's just beautiful music that brings me joy. So that's why I'm just a funketeer. And I was a kid in the '70s, so but I love that stuff, and it's interesting because I'll talk about this as I do other acts, Pink Floyd, whatever, as I bring in more aspects. But it's interesting because I've noticed with my siblings, and when you really first get involved in music and fall in love, whatever it is. I mean, I rarely meet people who aren't passionate about some musicians, but it's usually those middle school years, 13, 14, and 15. And I remember when I was working on my first album, that one of my coworkers listened to my music. She's like, "Man, you really like bass, don't you?" I was like, "Yeah, I love bass. I don't know why." But but if you listen to the funk from when I was had age 79, 80, 81, 82, I mean it was the Daz Band, it was Lakeside, it was the Gap Band. And they, Zap, they all had that fat bass, and I still, so I kind of absorbed that, and that fat bass lives in my music to this day. All right, so I did uh, a quick surprising songs on the one, and this is really Ray Charles's, that enhanced snare. Dirty Laundry was Don Henley. Bad Guy Billie Eilish. Pour Some Sugar on Me Def Leppard. Living on a Prayer Bon Jovi. As It Was Harry Styles. Heat Wave Glass Animals. I think that this week became the longest running um, song in the top 40 in history. And Peaches by Justin Bieber. So none of that's really considered funk, but all those songs are on the one, and that just tells you the funk lives on. Um, Now, got it. And I think at some point I'm definitely going to do a um, an episode, a history episode on disco. Disco gets a bad name, particularly with boomers, but disco never went anywhere. I mean, really, uh, um, techno and house and all this electronic dance music are the children of disco because they're all four to the floor. But the four to the floor beat came out of disco. When I say four to the floor, it's that that pounding bass drum, boop 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 boop. That's four to the floor. So what's the difference between, because the disco and funk, shared some similarities, and uh, white boomers don't like the funk and or the disco for the most part, and black boomers don't particularly care for the funk because uh, or disco because white boomers would put funk artists in with disco artists. So, but hey, we're about to untangle all of that. So what they had in common, disco and the funk, is that chicken scratch guitar. Think Quickie by George Clinton, Kiss by Prince, um, Super Funky Califragisexy by Prince if you have the Black Album. What else? Um, Alphabet Street by Prince. You know what I'm talking about. That little funky, that little funky chicken scratch guitar. And the other thing was it was the funky bass. And so really, to distinguish, you know, funk was usually on the one, and disco usually had four to the floor. Now, interestingly enough, some disco songs were on the one and four to the floor in the same song. Donna Summer was pretty famous for throwing both of them in there at the same time. Um, but the other difference is disco was the first user of drum machines, so they got the early, even in the early '70s. They were using, experimenting with drum machines, and it's interesting if you listen to, you know, from 77, 78, that disco, you can, if you find a good playlist on a disco playlist on Spotify, you can literally hear the transition in those 2 years from uh, disco to house. I mean, and it's that um, progression happens as the drum machines get better because the you know the real good. I mean, the 808 and the 909 I think came out from Roland in '82 and '83. I think the Oberheim DMX was the same. Now there are older drum machines, Roland had older ones. I think they had some drum machines going back to '77 and '78, which were used in disco. But the 808 and the 909 are still used today, and those were '82 and '83. So that's really when you start getting those. And I think Lynn Drum 82, but I think Lynn had one in '79. Of course, they were obscenely expensive, but so you can if you're interested, you can find a good disco playlist and listen to the disco from the late '70s, and literally hear it morph into house. Um, but one of the interesting things. Everybody considers Sly, the God, one of the the funk fathers, on that Mount Rushmore. But if you go back and you listen to There's a Riot Going On in 1970, Sly used a drum machine on that whole album, and there's a whole bunch of Sly, I mean, the DNA for There's a Riot Going On, is all through early, '70s disco. So, Sly is kind of, one of the fathers of disco as well. And I know the, black boomers aren't going to like that, but hey, the quote Lizzo, the truth hurts, and there's nothing wrong with disco. Disco has its merits. There's some real good music there. Um, so, time to clear up some misconceptions now that I've differentiated between funk and disco. Three songs are very contentious for white boomers coming from white artists, and so we're gonna. They claim all three of these songs are disco. The first one, Another One Bites the Dust by Queen. Uh, very similar to let's call it as it is, Good Times. Hey, but you can't copyright bass lines, and so it's very different songs, and I think Queen's admitted that Good Times um, influenced Another One Bites the Dust. Interestingly enough, most people consider Chic to be a disco band. I Want Your Love and Dance 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 is disco, but Le Freak and Good Times are funk. They are on the one. I don't believe they're four to the floor, but they are on the one. So is another one bites the dust? Is it funk or is it disco? I mean, it's universally white boomers think it is disco. It is not. There is a breakdown in the song that's on the one. There's no four to the floor. And good times again. That's a funk song. So that would be false. Next song, "Miss You" by the Rolling Stones. Even to this day, a lot. I hate that song. That was disco, yada yada yada. And Mick even, admitted, he was going to Studio 54, and that's, that's, "Miss You" came out of his Studio 54 trips. I think, I'll cut, white boomers a little slack here because, if it has that vibe from Saturday, "Staying Alive" from the Bee Gees. Um, you know, um, it has that swagger. I've always loved Michigan because it has a little bit of that swagger. But here's the thing, you know, disco in general did not have that swagger. I mean, now hip hop is full of swagger, but George Clinton had his own swagger. I mean, listen to Dr. Funkenstein, listen to um, Chocolate City. So George had his own kind of, um, uh, Isaac Hayes had his own swagger. But, Staying Alive by the Bee Gees borrowed that swagger from the theme from Shaft. So, Miss You because of the swagger and you know, um, funk had more swagger than disco. No, Miss You was funk. The final one, I Was Made for Loving You by Kiss. Yep, that's disco. That's four to the floor. Kiss fans hated it. It was one of the big fallouts. So everybody turned on Kiss. In the late '70s. The white rock folks. I love this song. It is. I think it's in their top five when it comes to their most streamed songs. Yeah, that's disco. And so what? Kiss is rocking that and playing it today. So who gonna end and talk about who actually is funk artists. Now, I mentioned, that funk being, the oneness and the unity and just the politics and being the music of the streets made it inherently political. So I think, you know, you don't have to be political to be part of the funk, but if you are a political artist from the '70s, then that automatically puts you in the funk. So Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On," that album is, I mean, makes me want to holler. Inner City Blues, that is a funky song just without the politics, and it's definitely a funk song. You know, even though Isaac Hayes is known as a more for his ballads, but he was a funk artist. He had a really good. He was sort of the funk rock. He had a great guitarist, Skip Hicks. So he was a little bit. If you listen to him, even in his ballads, they run for 14 minutes, and Skip would get to play some guitar for a while. So he wasn't as psychedelic as funkadelic in that early '70s, but he kind of had that. And Stevie, I mean, come on, Stevie, Higher Ground and Superstition. I mean, that was funky, but Stevie wasn't always funky. But Stevie was really political back in the day, and so really, Stevie's also a funk artist. And of course, you have the Bar-Kays and the Ohio Players, and I used to before I got my honestly before I got hip and really looked at the broader, the political, aspects of the funk and really what is funk. I would always say, well, can function, even though funk's in the name. They were part-time funk. They were R&B and street legal funk, but they're funk. They're definitely funk. Um, So yeah, that's the so I went from a list of maybe 20 to probably 100 acts I would consider funk from the 70s, and the funk lives on in hip hop. I mean, no funk, there is no hip hop, and George talks about that. They're basically his children, and you know particularly the classic rap era, the late 80s and 90s folks who really embrace George because they know how important he is to hip hop. And now in James Brown as well. James was very, very important to hip hop. Um, so yeah, that's kind of the essence of the funk.